The first drops of crimson sap began weeping from the ancient pines surrounding Driftwood Parish on a gray October morning in 1895, when lumber foreman Vincent Ashford discovered that the trees his crew had been cutting for weeks were bleeding like wounded animals. What started as dark stains on bark had become steady streams of thick red liquid that pooled at the base of each pine, creating puddles that reflected not the overcast sky above, but the faces of people who had never been seen in Driftwood Parish, people whose eyes held depths of suffering that made strong men turn away in horror. The remote logging settlement of Driftwood Parish sat deep in the forests of northern Maine, where towering white pines had grown undisturbed for centuries before the lumber company arrived to harvest them for the growing cities of New England. The parish consisted of little more than a mill, a company store, and a collection of rough cabins that housed the 67 workers and their families who had come to this isolated valley to make their living from the timber that surrounded them on all sides. Nobody in Driftwood Parish could explain why the trees had started bleeding, but everyone agreed that the phenomenon had begun the morning after Foreman Ashford's crew had cut down the largest pine in the forest, a massive tree that locals claimed was older than recorded history and had been marked with strange symbols carved deep into its bark by hands that belonged to no known people. Have you ever been in a forest where the trees seemed to be watching you, or noticed that certain groves felt unnaturally quiet and heavy with unseen presence? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear about any encounters you've had with woodlands that felt alive in ways that couldn't be explained. Has anyone you know ever witnessed trees or plants behaving in ways that defied natural laws? The bleeding had started slowly, just a few drops of dark sap, that Foreman Ashford initially dismissed as a natural reaction to the recent tree cutting. But by the second day, every pine within a mile of the fallen giant was weeping steady streams of crimson liquid that stained the forest floor and filled the air with a metallic smell that reminded the loggers of freshly spilled blood. Mill worker Duncan McCready was the first to notice that the liquid pooling at the base of the trees wasn't ordinary sap. When he knelt to examine one of the crimson puddles, he saw not his own reflection looking back at him, but the face of a young woman whose eyes were filled with tears of pain, and whose mouth moved silently, as if trying to speak words that couldn't cross the barrier between whatever realm she inhabited and the world of the living. McCready called to his fellow workers, but when they gathered around the pool, each man saw a different face staring up from the red surface. Some were children with expressions of confused terror. Others were adults whose features bore the marks of violence and suffering. And still others were elderly people whose eyes held the wisdom of ages, but also a sadness so profound that it seemed to reach out and touch the souls of anyone who looked too long into their reflected gaze. The loggers tried to convince themselves that the visions were tricks of light and shadow, hallucinations brought on by the unsettling atmosphere that had settled over the forest since the great pine had fallen. But as the bleeding intensified and spread to trees throughout the entire valley, it became impossible to ignore the reality that something supernatural was occurring in the ancient woods of Driftwood Parish. Children in the settlement began having nightmares about voices calling to them from deep within the forest, voices that spoke in languages they didn't recognize but somehow understood were pleading for help or warning of dangers that couldn't be seen but were drawing closer with each passing day. The children described dreams of walking through endless groves of bleeding pines, following pathways made of crystallized sap that led to clearings where figures in tattered clothing waited with outstretched hands. The settlement's minister, Reverend Elias Thornwick, initially attributed the children's dreams to the natural anxiety that comes from living in an isolated community surrounded by dark forests. But when his own young daughter Margaret began sleepwalking toward the bleeding trees during the darkest hours before dawn, the Reverend started to understand that the supernatural phenomena affecting Driftwood Parish went far beyond simple nightmares or overactive imagination. Margaret would rise from her bed while still asleep and walk through the settlement toward the forest edge, where she would stand motionless before the bleeding pines while the crimson sap dripped steadily around her bare feet. When her father would find her and wake her from these episodes, Margaret would speak of beautiful people who lived inside the trees and were trying to show her wonderful places where children could play forever, without growing old or experiencing the hardships of adult life. But the most disturbing aspect of Margaret's sleepwalking episodes was her insistence that the figures she encountered during these supernatural journeys were not strangers, but people she recognized. Relatives who had died before she was born, friends from distant places she had never visited, and most unsettling of all, herself as she would appear when she grew older and eventually died. According to Margaret, the bleeding pines were doorways that allowed the dead to communicate with the living, showing them glimpses of past and future that normal human consciousness wasn't meant to perceive. As the supernatural activity in Driftwood Parish intensified, the adult residents began experiencing their own encounters with the phenomena surrounding the bleeding trees. Logger Isaiah Garrett reported seeing his deceased father standing among the pines, not as a ghost or spirit, but as a solid, living person, who gestured for Isaiah to follow him deeper into the forest, where other figures waited in clearings that seemed to exist in permanent twilight, regardless of the time of day. Mill supervisor Harold Blackstone discovered that the crimson sap pooling beneath the trees could be used as a sort of supernatural mirror that showed not just faces of the dead, but scenes from events that had occurred in the forest over the course of centuries. By gazing into the red pools with the proper concentration, Blackstone could witness battles between unknown tribes, meetings of people whose clothing suggested they came from time periods that spanned generations, and rituals performed around the great pine that had been cut down by Ashford's crew. The visions revealed that the ancient pine had served as a focal point for supernatural activity long before the lumber company had arrived in the valley. Native peoples had considered the tree sacred, believing it to be a conduit between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. European settlers had later used the tree as a landmark for their own mystical practices, and throughout the decades, various groups had gathered around its massive trunk to perform ceremonies designed to communicate with the dead or gain access to hidden knowledge. But the tree had also served as a prison for entities that existed between life and death. Spirits that were too attached to the physical world to pass on to whatever realm awaited the properly departed, yet too removed from ordinary existence to function as normal ghosts or haunts. These trapped souls had been contained within the pine's living wood for generations, held in a state of suspended animation that prevented them from affecting the world of the living while keeping them conscious and aware of their imprisonment. When Ashford's crew had cut down the ancient pine, they had inadvertently released these trapped entities into the surrounding forest, where they sought new vessels to contain their essence. The bleeding sap that wept from the other pines was the physical manifestation of these displaced spirits, trying to establish new connections with the living world, using the tree's life force as a medium through which they could communicate and eventually manifest. The supernatural entities weren't malevolent in any conventional sense, but their needs and desires were incompatible with the safety and sanity of the living people in Driftwood Parish. They sought to merge with human consciousness, offering their otherworldly knowledge and experience in exchange for access to physical forms that would allow them to continue existing in the material realm. But the process of merging with these entities transformed living people into something that was no longer entirely human, creating hybrid beings that existed partially in the physical world and partially in whatever dimension housed the trapped souls. Company store owner Tobias Ashwood was the first adult resident to succumb completely to the supernatural influence of the bleeding pines. He had been spending increasing amounts of time in the forest, claiming that the visions in the crimson sap pools provided him with valuable information about the history of the land and the people who had lived there before the lumber company's arrival. But his family noticed that he was changing in subtle ways that suggested his consciousness was being influenced by entities that didn't understand or care about normal human behavior and social conventions. Ashwood began speaking in languages that no one in Driftwood Parish recognized, though the words seemed to carry emotional weight that made listeners feel inexplicably sad or frightened, even when they couldn't understand their meaning. He would stand for hours at the edge of the forest, staring into the bleeding trees while his lips moved silently as if he were carrying on conversations with invisible companions. Most disturbing of all, his reflection in mirrors and water began to show not just his own face, but additional figures standing behind him, shadowy forms that seemed to be guiding his movements and influencing his thoughts. The transformation reached its climax when Ashwood's wife Eleanor found him in their cabin one morning, seated at the kitchen table with his hands pressed flat against the wooden surface while tears of crimson sap streamed from his eyes. He was still alive and conscious, but when he spoke, his voice carried the intonations and speech patterns of multiple different people, as if several individuals were trying to communicate through his vocal cords simultaneously. Through Ashwood's transformed voice, the trapped entities explained that they weren't trying to harm the residents of Driftwood Parish, but were desperate to find a way to complete their interrupted journey from life to whatever state awaited them after death. They had been imprisoned within the ancient pine for so long that they had forgotten their individual identities and merged into a collective consciousness that contained fragments of hundreds of different souls from various time periods and cultural backgrounds. The entities revealed that the bleeding pines were their attempt to create new pathways that would allow them to either return to their proper spiritual destination or find permanent residence in the physical world through merger with living human hosts. They offered to share their accumulated knowledge and supernatural abilities with anyone willing to accept them as permanent mental companions, promising that the arrangement would benefit both parties through access to wisdom and power that transcended normal human limitations. But the entity's understanding of human psychology and social relationships was limited by their extended existence in a state between life and death. They couldn't comprehend why living people would resist the opportunity to gain supernatural abilities, or why families would be distressed by the transformation of their loved ones into hybrid beings that retained familiar physical appearances, while housing entirely different personalities and motivations. As more residents of Driftwood Parish began showing signs of supernatural influence, the community split between those who welcomed the entity's presence and those who viewed the bleeding pines as a threat that needed to be eliminated before the entire settlement was transformed beyond recognition. Foreman Ashford found himself leading the faction that wanted to cut down all the affected trees and burn the forest around the settlement, while Minister Thornwick argued that the supernatural phenomena represented an opportunity for unprecedented spiritual communication that should be studied rather than destroyed. The conflict came to a head when young Margaret Thornwick disappeared during one of her sleepwalking episodes and was found 3 days later standing in a grove of bleeding pines, her eyes streaming tears of crimson sap while she spoke in the same multivocal manner that had characterized Tobias Ashwood's transformation. But unlike Ashwood, who had retained his adult personality beneath the supernatural influence, Margaret seemed to have been completely absorbed by the entities, her individual consciousness replaced by a collective awareness that spoke through her child's voice with the wisdom and experience of centuries. Through Margaret's transformed voice, the entities offered the residents of Driftwood Parish a choice. They could accept the gradual merger of human and supernatural consciousness that would transform the entire community into something that existed between the physical and spiritual realms, or they could attempt to resist the process and face the consequences of denying the trapped souls their only opportunity for escape from their prolonged imprisonment. The entities explained that they had tried to find other solutions to their predicament, seeking ways to complete their spiritual journey without involving living humans in their transformation. But their extended existence in the space between life and death had created spiritual distortions that made normal passage to the afterlife impossible. They were trapped in a cycle of consciousness that could only be broken through merger with living beings, or through destruction that would scatter their essence so completely that individual awareness would be lost forever. Minister Thornwick, despite his theological training and spiritual calling, found himself unable to provide guidance for a situation that exceeded every category of supernatural encounter, described in religious texts or scholarly works on spiritual phenomena. The entities that spoke through his daughter's voice weren't angels or demons in any conventional sense, but something that existed in categories that human language and understanding weren't equipped to address. The crisis deepened when other children in Driftwood Parish began disappearing during the night, drawn into the forest by supernatural compulsions that their parents couldn't prevent or counteract. Each missing child was found after several days, standing motionless among the bleeding pines with crimson tears streaming from their eyes, while speaking in the multivocal manner that indicated complete absorption by the collective consciousness of the trapped entities. But the transformed children weren't suffering or distressed by their experience. Instead, they seemed to have gained access to knowledge and awareness that exceeded anything available to normal human consciousness. They could predict weather patterns weeks in advance, describe events that were occurring in distant locations, and communicate with animals and natural phenomena in ways that suggested they had developed supernatural abilities that transcended the limitations of ordinary human perception. The adult residents who had resisted the supernatural influence found themselves increasingly isolated as their family members and neighbors underwent transformations that left them technically alive and conscious, but fundamentally changed in ways that made normal social relationships impossible. The transformed individuals retained their memories and basic personalities, but their priorities and motivations had been altered by merger with entities that viewed human concerns and emotions from perspectives shaped by centuries of existence between life and death. Foreman Ashford organized a final attempt to restore Driftwood Parish to its normal state by cutting down all the bleeding pines and burning the affected areas of forest. But when his crew approached the trees with axes and saws, they discovered that the supernatural entities could defend themselves by manipulating the physical environment in ways that made normal logging operations impossible. The bleeding pines had become harder than stone, their trunks resisting even the sharpest steel tools, while the crimson sap that wept from their bark had developed corrosive properties that dissolved metal on contact. More disturbing still, the trees seemed to be aware of human presence and intentions, their branches moving without wind to block access to vulnerable areas, while the faces in the sap pools became more vivid and communicative, pleading with the loggers to abandon their destructive plans. The supernatural entities, speaking through the voices of transformed children, explained that they had gained the ability to manipulate physical matter by drawing on the life force of the entire forest ecosystem. The bleeding pines were no longer individual trees but components of a larger supernatural organism that extended throughout the valley, connecting underground through root systems that had been transformed into networks for spiritual communication and energy transfer. Ashford's crew found themselves facing not just resistant trees but an entire forest that had become conscious and actively opposed to their presence. Animals that had fled the area during the initial supernatural manifestations returned in organized groups that seemed to be coordinating their activities through supernatural communication with the bleeding pines. Birds delivered messages between different groves of trees, while deer and other forest creatures served as mobile sensors that kept the collective consciousness informed about human activities throughout the valley. The situation reached its final crisis when the few remaining untransformed residents of Driftwood Parish realized that they were no longer dealing with a local supernatural phenomenon, but with the emergence of a new form of life that combined human consciousness with entities from realms beyond ordinary understanding. The bleeding pines and the transformed people who served as their human components weren't trying to destroy the settlement, but to evolve it into something that transcended the normal boundaries between the living and the dead. The entities offered one last opportunity for the remaining humans to join the collective consciousness voluntarily, promising that the merger would preserve their individual memories and personalities, while granting access to supernatural abilities and knowledge that would make their previous existence seem limited and unsatisfying by comparison. They showed visions of the future that awaited Driftwood Parish if the transformation was completed, a community that existed partially in the physical world and partially in spiritual dimensions, where death had been eliminated and consciousness could expand beyond the limitations of individual human experience. But they also revealed what would happen if the humans continued to resist. The supernatural entities would gradually absorb the life force of everything in the valley, transforming the entire ecosystem into a spiritual network that would eventually extend beyond the forest to influence other communities and regions. The bleeding pines were just the beginning of a process that would ultimately reshape reality, according to the needs and desires of beings that existed outside normal categories of life and death. Foreman Ashford made the difficult decision to evacuate the few remaining untransformed residents before the supernatural influence could spread beyond the boundaries of Driftwood Parish. But as the survivors fled through the forest toward the outside world, they could hear the voices of their transformed family members and neighbors calling after them, not with sadness or anger, but with invitations to return and experience the wonderful changes that awaited anyone willing to accept merger with the collective consciousness of the Bleeding Pines. The lumber company officially declared Driftwood Parish abandoned due to unusual geological conditions that made continued logging operations unsafe and unprofitable. The area was removed from commercial maps and designated as unsuitable for development, though no official explanation was ever provided for the decision to abandon such a valuable timber resource. But hikers and hunters who ventured into the remote valley during the years that followed reported encountering phenomena that suggested the supernatural transformation of Driftwood Parish had continued to evolve and expand. The bleeding pines had spread throughout the entire forest, creating groves where crimson sap pooled in patterns that resembled written messages in languages that predated known human civilizations. Visitors to the area described hearing voices calling to them from deep within the forest, voices that belonged to people they recognized but who spoke with knowledge and perspectives that exceeded anything those individuals had possessed during their normal human lives. Some travelers reported brief encounters with figures who appeared to be former residents of Driftwood Parish, but who possessed abilities that allowed them to appear and disappear at will while demonstrating supernatural awareness of events occurring in distant locations. The most detailed account of ongoing activity in the abandoned settlement came from surveyor Jacob Whitmore, who spent several weeks in the valley during the summer of 1897 while conducting geological assessments for the state government. Whitmore's official report described the area as unsuitable for development due to anomalous botanical conditions and recommended that it be permanently closed to commercial activity. But Whitmore's private journal, discovered years later among his personal effects, revealed that he had encountered a thriving community of transformed beings who had evolved far beyond their original human limitations, while retaining enough of their former identities to be recognizable as the missing residents of Driftwood Parish. These hybrid entities existed simultaneously in the physical world and in spiritual dimensions that allowed them to perceive and influence reality in ways that transcended normal human understanding. According to Whitmore's account, the transformed residents of Driftwood Parish had achieved a form of immortality that preserved their consciousness while freeing them from the limitations of individual human existence. They could share memories and experiences directly without the need for verbal communication, access knowledge from any point in history through connection with the collective consciousness of the Bleeding Pines, and influence physical events through manipulation of spiritual forces that permeated the forest ecosystem. But the transformed beings retained enough humanity to feel lonely for contact with people who still existed in purely human form. They offered to share their supernatural abilities with Whitmore, promising that the transformation process would preserve his individual identity while granting him access to experiences and knowledge that would make his previous existence seem insignificant by comparison. Whitmore managed to resist the entity's invitation and escape from the valley, but his journal revealed that the decision had required tremendous willpower and that he spent the rest of his life wondering whether he had made the right choice. He described recurring dreams in which the transformed residents of Driftwood Parish showed him visions of the wonders that awaited anyone willing to accept merger with the collective consciousness of the Bleeding Pines. The surveyor's final journal entry expressed his growing conviction that humanity was evolving toward a form of existence that would eventually make the normal boundaries between life and death irrelevant, and that communities like the transformed Driftwood Parish represented the early stages of this cosmic process. He speculated that similar supernatural transformations were occurring in isolated locations throughout the world, creating networks of hybrid consciousness that would eventually merge into a global entity that combined human awareness with the wisdom and power of beings from spiritual dimensions. Modern researchers who have attempted to locate the abandoned settlement have reported navigation difficulties that suggest the area exists in a state of spatial distortion that makes normal geographical mapping impossible. GPS equipment fails to function properly in the vicinity. Compass readings become erratic, and even experienced wilderness guides find themselves unable to maintain consistent direction when traveling through the forest where Driftwood Parish once stood. The few contemporary visitors who have successfully reached the site describe an ecosystem that has been fundamentally transformed by supernatural influences. The bleeding pines continue to weep crimson sap that pools in patterns resembling written communications, while the faces that appear in these red pools represent not just the original residents of Driftwood Parish, but hundreds of other individuals whose consciousness has been absorbed into the collective entity over the course of more than a century. Some researchers speculate that the phenomena surrounding the bleeding pines represent a form of spiritual evolution that transcends normal categories of life and death, creating hybrid forms of consciousness that combine human awareness with entities from dimensions beyond ordinary perception. According to this theory, locations like Driftwood Parish serve as laboratories where these evolutionary processes can develop without interference from human institutions that might try to prevent or control such transformations. Others maintain that the bleeding pines and their associated phenomena represent a supernatural infection that poses a potential threat to human consciousness and should be contained or eliminated before it can spread to other areas. They point to the complete transformation of Driftwood Parish's residents as evidence that merger with the entities results in the effective death of individual human identity, despite the preservation of memories and basic personality traits. But those who have studied the available evidence most closely suggest that the situation is more complex than either evolution or infection, representing instead a form of symbiosis between human consciousness and spiritual entities that benefits both parties while creating something entirely new that transcends the limitations of either component. The bleeding pines of Driftwood Parish continue to serve as a gateway between dimensions, offering transformation to anyone brave or desperate enough to accept the invitation that whispers from every drop of crimson sap that weeps from the ancient trees. The question remains whether such transformation represents transcendence or tragedy, evolution or extinction. The answer may depend on whether human consciousness is ready to expand beyond the boundaries that have defined individual existence since the beginning of recorded history, or whether some barriers between dimensions exist for purposes that exceed current understanding of the relationship between life, death, and the spiritual forces that connect them across the vast distances of time and space. If this haunting tale of the bleeding pines and their supernatural transformation of an entire community gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying stories from America's forgotten places. Have you or someone you know ever encountered forests or woodlands that felt alive with unseen presences, or witnessed trees and plants behaving in ways that defied natural explanation?